I am Stella, 32 years old, and for 5 years my parents told everyone I vanished into thin air after I selfishly stopped sending money home. Then they sent my older brother to track me down. He pounded on my front door ready to demand his cash, but when he looked past me into my living room, the blood completely drained from his face. He stumbled backward down the stone steps, with his phone pressed to his ear, whispering to our mother that she needed to see this because I never told them the truth. I had no idea that opening my door that morning would trigger the systematic destruction of the fake empire they had built. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own future. The morning started like any other beautiful day in Malibu, California. The Pacific Ocean breeze drifted through the open balcony windows of my estate. At $15 million, the property was a fortress of glass and modern steel, perched high above the stunning coastline. I had just finished my morning coffee and was adjusting the cuffs of my navy blue Tom Ford suit. The sharp tailoring made me feel invincible, a stark contrast to the oversized sweatshirts I used to hide in when I lived under my parents' roof. I was preparing for a board meeting when the sudden, violent sound of fists hammering against heavy wood echoed through the foyer. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, entitled pounding of someone who believed they owned whatever was on the other side of that door. I walked over to the security monitor mounted on the wall. The high-definition camera feed showed a man standing on my front porch, his face flushed with anger and entitlement. It was Connor, my 34-year-old brother. He wore a designer suit that looked slightly rumpled, probably from the long drive up the coast, and his hair was slicked back in that familiar, arrogant style. For a fraction of a second, the old conditioning kicked in. My chest tightened and my breath hitched. But then I looked down at my expensive suit, remembered the business empire I had built with my own 2 hands, and let out a steady breath. I was no longer the frightened scapegoat of our family. I pressed a button to unlock the security gate and walked calmly to the front door, pulling it open with a smooth motion. Connor practically lunged forward the moment the door swung wide, stopping just inches from my face. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I had been for the last half-decade. He simply launched into a furious tirade, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of my grand entryway. "You selfish brat," he spat out, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and disbelief at my surroundings. "Mom and Dad are about to lose their house. They are drowning in default notices, and it is all because you decided to play a disappearing act. You just stopped the wire transfers and vanished. $5,000 a month, Stella. That was what kept them afloat. You owe them that money. They raised you. They fed you. And you just cut them off without a single word to live in some rented mansion while your own flesh and blood faces homelessness today." He was breathing heavily, clearly expecting me to wither under his aggression. In the past, his loud voice and imposing stature would have sent me shrinking into a corner, eager to apologize and fix whatever problem he had created. I would have scrambled to write a check just to make the yelling stop. My parents had trained me perfectly to be the shock absorber for every crisis Connor manufactured. But standing there on the polished marble floor of the home I owned outright, I felt absolutely nothing but cold clinical detachment. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked him up and down, taking in the desperation sweating through his expensive cologne. "You are mistaken about a few things, Connor," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly level. "First of all, I do not rent this house. I own it. Every single square foot of it. And second, that $5,000 a month was never an allowance for Mom and Dad to live their luxurious lifestyle. It was a debt repayment." Connor opened his mouth to argue, but I held up a single hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "Do not interrupt me." I continued, my tone slicing through his entitlement like ice. "I know exactly what happened. When you were 25 years old, you got drunk and drove your brand new Porsche straight into a concrete barrier. You totaled a car you could not afford, leaving an $80,000 loan hanging in the balance. Mom and Dad panicked because their golden child was about to face financial ruin and potential criminal charges. So they turned to me, the daughter they constantly called a failure. They sat me down at the kitchen table and told me that because I was just a girl, it was my duty to sacrifice for the men in the family. They forced me to co-sign that predatory loan to save you from bankruptcy. I wired $5,000 every single month for years to clear that specific debt, I said, taking a step closer to him. I worked grueling hours sacrificing my peace of mind to pay for your reckless mistake. But the day I sent that final payment, the day the balance hit zero, my obligation to this family ended permanently. The debt is paid, Connor. My financial prison closed, and you get absolutely nothing from me here today. Connor stared at me, his jaw working as he tried to process my refusal. For a man who spent his life getting exactly what he wanted by throwing a tantrum, my denial was incomprehensible to him. His face contorted from shock back to a deep red. He scoffed, a harsh sound echoing in the grand foyer, and stepped forward using his physical size to intimidate me. He pushed his shoulder past mine, stepping uninvited over the threshold of my home. He thought he could just barge in, dominate my space, and take whatever he believed was rightfully his. You really think you can just shut the door on us, Stella? He demanded, his voice rising in pitch as he paced a few steps into the entryway. You think buying some fancy house gives you the right to turn your back on your own blood? We are family. I am your brother. If you will not write a check right now, I will take whatever is in this house to pawn. I am not leaving here empty-handed, and you cannot stop me. I stood my ground near the open front door, watching him unravel. I did not call for security yet. I wanted him to walk further inside. I wanted him to see exactly what awaited him in the heart of my home. Go ahead, Connor, I said, gesturing toward the expansive living room that opened up past the foyer. Take a look around. See if you can find anything that belongs to you. He sneered and marched past the marble columns, his dress shoes clicking loudly against the polished floor. He reached the sunken living room, a sprawling space framed by floor-to-ceiling glass panels that offered a panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean. But it was not the breathtaking view that made Connor freeze in his tracks. It was the woman sitting casually on the white Italian leather sofa. Aaliyah, his beautiful, brilliant 33-year-old wife, sat with her legs crossed elegantly. The morning sunlight caught the rich, deep tones of her dark skin and the sharp lines of her emerald green tailored dress. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in one hand, completely relaxed, looking entirely at home in my mansion. Connor stumbled backward, his mouth falling open. He blinked rapidly, rubbing his eyes as if he were staring at a mirage. Aaliyah, he choked out, his voice reduced to a hoarse whisper. What are you doing here? You are supposed to be in Chicago. Your flight left yesterday morning. Aaliyah took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne. She lowered the glass, letting the silence stretch and wrap around Connor like a suffocating blanket. I never went to the airport, Connor, she said, her voice smooth and devoid of any affection. I drove straight here. Stella and I had some important business to finish this morning. And honestly, the weather in Malibu is much better for audits than Chicago. Connor looked frantically between me and his wife, his mind short-circuiting as he tried to connect the impossible dots. Business. What business? You two do not even talk. My mother hates Stella. You hate Stella. Alia laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the tension in the room. I do not hate Stella, Connor. I respect her. In fact, I respect her so much that I have been working for her for the last 3 years. She leaned forward and picked up a thick, heavy stack of manila folders resting on the glass coffee table. With a flick of her wrist, she dropped the massive pile of documents onto the glass surface. The loud smack echoed through the living room like a gunshot. Connor jumped. I am a forensic auditor. Aaliyah continued, resting her elbows on her knees and clasping her hands together. My entire career is built on finding hidden numbers, tracing fake accounts, and identifying corporate rot. 3 years ago, Stella approached me. She needed someone with elite financial clearance and absolute discretion to serve as the chief financial investigator for her firm, Aegis Holdings. I took the job. Connor shook his head, his hands trembling as he pointed a finger at her. You work for her. My wife works for my runaway sister. Why would you do that? You make a fortune at your accounting firm. Why would you hide this from me? Because you are a thief, Connor. Aaliyah stated flatly. stripping away the last remaining shred of her marital warmth. And you are a very sloppy thief. I did not just work for Stella to track her business acquisitions. I worked for her to track you. I know exactly what you have been doing at your investment bank. Connor took another staggering step backward, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. Aaliyah tapped her polished fingernail against the top folder on the table. Inside these files is the complete, unredacted financial history of your private banking activities for the last 24 months, she declared. I know about the offshore routing accounts. I know about the phantom client portfolios you created to move money without triggering internal compliance flags. I know that you have been systematically siphoning funds from your own firm to cover your massive secret gambling debts. You lost over $400,000 betting on overseas sports syndicates, and you stole your clients' capital to pay off the bookies so they would not break your legs. You thought you were outsmarting the system, but you left a digital trail so wide a first-year accounting student could follow it. You are not just a bad husband and a terrible brother. You are a federal criminal. Connor gasped for air, clutching his chest, as if he were suddenly having a heart attack. The arrogant, demanding man who had pounded on my door minutes ago was completely gone, replaced by a terrified criminal realizing the trap had permanently snapped tightly shut around him today. The terrified silence that filled the sprawling living room did not last long. Connor stood frozen for exactly 5 seconds before the crushing reality of his situation finally breached his thick skull. Fear morphed into something much more dangerous. His eyes darted from my face to Aaliyah, and then fixated entirely on the thick stack of manila folders resting on the glass coffee table. Those files contained the blueprints of his destruction. They were the tangible proof of every stolen dollar and every broken law. If he could just get his hands on them, if he could destroy the physical evidence right here and now, maybe he could buy himself time to run. A primitive blind rage washed over his features, twisting his handsome face into an ugly mask of pure desperation. He let out a guttural roar, a sound completely devoid of his usual polished charm, and threw his entire body weight forward. He lunged past me with surprising speed, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the marble as he scrambled desperately toward the center of the room. He reached out with both hands, his fingers extended like claws, aiming directly for the financial documents that Aaliyah had so carefully compiled. He screamed that she was a traitor, that she had no right to steal his private property, and that he would destroy her for crossing him. He honestly thought he could physically overpower 2 women in a home he did not own, completely ignoring the fact that I had left my vulnerable past behind me a long time ago. He thought his brute strength would save him from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. But I had spent 5 years preparing for the day my family would finally come looking for me. I had anticipated every possible reaction, especially violence. I did not scream. I did not panic. I simply stood my ground, raised my right hand, and snapped my fingers. The sharp, cracking sound of my snap echoed sharply against the high vaulted ceiling. Instantly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. From the deep shadows of the adjoining hallway, 2 massive figures stepped forward in perfect synchronization. They were not ordinary security guards. They were elite, highly trained private protection contractors I had hired specifically to secure my estate against any unpredictable family members. Dressed in immaculate black suits that barely concealed their muscular builds, they moved with terrifying speed and total silence. Before Connor could even close the remaining distance to the glass coffee table, the first guard intercepted his path. A large gloved hand shot out and clamped down onto Connor's shoulder, stopping his forward momentum completely. Connor gasped in shock as the second guard stepped up right behind him. Together, they executed a flawless professional takedown. They twisted his arms securely behind his back, lifting him slightly off his feet so his expensive shoes scrambled uselessly against the air. With a swift and calculated motion, they marched him backward and slammed him firmly against the solid oak paneling of the living room wall. The impact knocked the wind right out of his lungs. Connor let out a harsh grunt of pain as his cheek was pressed flat against the polished wood. The guards held him completely immobilized, their grips like iron vices. He thrashed wildly, kicking his legs and spitting out endless streams of profanity. He demanded that they unhand him immediately. He screamed that he would sue them for assault, that he was an important executive at a major investment bank, and that they had no idea who they were messing with. But his threats fell on entirely deaf ears. The guards did not speak a single word. They merely tightened their hold, pressing him harder against the wall until his desperate struggles were reduced to pathetic, heavy panting. He was trapped utterly powerless in the home of the sister he had spent his entire life trying to dominate. Aaliyah remained seated on the white leather sofa throughout the entire physical altercation. She had not even flinched when Connor charged toward her. Now she slowly set her crystal champagne flute down on the coffee table next to the financial files. She smoothed out an invisible wrinkle in her emerald green dress and stood up with absolute grace. From the seat cushion next to her, she picked up a thick, unmarked manila envelope. The contrast between her elegant, unbothered demeanor and his frantic, animalistic struggling was stunning to watch. She took her time walking across the room, her heels tapping a steady rhythmic beat on the floor that sounded exactly like the terrifying ticking of an unavoidable countdown clock reaching zero. Connor watched her approach with wide, panicked eyes, his chest heaving violently against the hardwood paneling as he finally realized that his entire carefully constructed life was officially over. He pleaded with her now, his voice cracking as he begged her to call off the guards, promising that they could work things out if she would just listen to him. Aaliyah did not respond to his desperate bargaining. She stopped directly in front of him, standing just inches away. She reached out and casually slid the thick manila envelope right into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. She patted the fabric smoothly, as if adjusting his wardrobe before a big meeting. She leaned in close, her lips brushing near his ear, and whispered her final message. "Those are the divorce papers, Connor. I signed them this morning. And attached to the back of those papers is a carbon copy of the comprehensive embezzlement report I officially sent to your bank's board of directors exactly 10 minutes ago. They are waiting for you." Connor let out a strangled, sobbing cry. Aaliyah turned away without a second glance. I nodded to the security team. The guards dragged Connor backward through the foyer, ignoring his pleas, and threw him out onto the street before slamming the heavy door shut. The heavy thud of my front door closing felt like the dropping of a curtain on the first act of my liberation. Aaliyah and I spent the rest of that evening finalizing our strategies, anticipating the inevitable retaliation. We knew Connor would immediately run crying to our parents, spinning a fabricated tale of unprovoked victimization. We also knew they would not wait long to act. Sure enough, less than 24 hours later, the intercom system on my security gate buzzed sharply. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing the morning financial reports, while Aaliyah was in the guest suite, conducting a final sweep of Connor's remaining assets. I pressed the communication button and looked at the high-definition video feed. Parked directly blocking my driveway was a large rented black SUV. Standing outside the driver's side door, looking thoroughly impatient and deeply offended by the closed iron gate, were my parents, Susan and Thomas. They had clearly packed in a hurry. Through the vehicle windows, I could see a massive pile of designer luggage haphazardly shoved into the back seats. They were not here for a brief visit. They were here to stay. They intended to forcefully occupy my home and refused to leave until I submitted to their financial demands. Susan leaned heavily against the intercom speaker, her face arranged in an overly exaggerated expression of maternal distress. She wore a beige cashmere sweater that looked expensive but dated, clinging to the appearance of wealth they no longer possessed. Thomas stood right behind her, his arms crossed over his chest, trying to project his usual patriarchal authority, despite the rented car and the desperate situation. "Stella, honey, please open the gate," Susan called out, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness that made my stomach turn. "We drove all night to get here. Connor called us yesterday sounding completely hysterical. He told us the most awful lies about you and Aaliyah. We knew we had to come straight to Malibu to check on our precious daughter. Open up, sweetheart. We have our bags, and we are ready to stay, as long as you need us, to help you sort through whatever mental breakdown you are currently experiencing." The sheer audacity of her approach was breathtaking. She was attempting to gaslight me right at my own front gate. She wanted to frame my independence and my alliance with Aaliyah as a psychological crisis that required parental intervention. I tapped the microphone button, ensuring my voice broadcasted loud and clear through the outdoor speakers. "There is no mental breakdown, Susan," I stated coldly, refusing to use the word mom. "And there is absolutely no reason for you to bring your luggage to my property. You are not coming inside." The fake maternal warmth instantly evaporated from Susan's face. Her eyes narrowed into familiar slits of disapproval. She glanced back at Thomas, silently demanding that he take control of this rebellious display. Thomas stepped forward, pushing Susan slightly aside so he could speak directly into the camera. "Stella, this has gone far enough," he barked, employing his sternest disciplinary tone. "Do not play games with your mother. Open this gate immediately. We are your parents. You owe us the basic respect of letting us into your home. We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. Now that we are going through a temporary financial rough patch, it is your duty to provide a roof over ours. We are moving in until things settle down. The bank is being unreasonable about the mortgage back home, and we need a place to stay. You have more than enough room in that massive house. It is the least you can do after everything we sacrificed for you." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed through the outdoor speakers. "You want to talk about sacrifices?" "Thomas," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of intimidation. "Let us talk about them. Providing a roof over a child's head is the bare minimum legal requirement of parenting, not a favor that incurs a lifetime debt. You did not sacrifice for me. You tolerated my existence while pouring every ounce of your resources, affection, and attention into Connor. You only remember you have a daughter when your golden boy causes a disaster you cannot afford to fix. You are not moving into my house. You are not taking over my guest rooms. You are going to turn that rented SUV around and drive back to whatever reality you are trying to escape." The rejection hit Thomas hard. His face turned deep crimson, and he pounded his fist against the intercom pillar. "You ungrateful wretch!" he yelled, abandoning all pretense of a polite visit. "We are family. You owe us." "I owe you nothing," I answered smoothly. "The only reason you are standing at my gate is because your primary bank account, built by siphoning the money I gave you for Connor's mistakes, is completely empty. I know you co-signed another high-risk loan for his recent project. I know default notices have arrived. You did not come to check on my well-being. You came here to turn my home into your personal shelter and use my bank accounts as your personal ATM. That stops today. I am terminating this conversation. Do not attempt to climb the fence, or I will have you arrested for trespassing." Susan began screaming, her voice shrill and panicked, begging me to reconsider, while Thomas kicked the heavy iron gate in a futile display of temper. I simply took my finger off the communication button, cutting off their audio feed entirely. I stood in my quiet, secure kitchen, watching the silent video monitor as they continued to rage against the immovable barrier, separating my peaceful sanctuary from their chaotic, parasitic world. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat, and calmly waited for their next predictable move. The silence on the video monitor did not last. I watched Thomas kick the heavy iron base of the gate one last time before stepping back, chest heaving with exertion. Susan, however, was not finished. She shoved her husband aside and slammed her palm flat against the call button, holding it down so her voice would force its way back through the external speakers into my kitchen. I sighed, setting my coffee mug down on the pristine marble counter, and tapped the communication button to open the audio line once more. I knew exactly what tactics she would attempt next. When intimidation failed, my mother always pivoted to the martyr routine. "Stella, how can you be so cruel?" Susan wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured grief. "We gave you everything. We sacrificed our own financial security to make sure you had a future. Do you have any idea how much we suffered to put you through college? We went into massive debt just so you could get your degree and build this fancy life you are throwing in our faces. We paid for your tuition, your housing, your books. We gave up our own dreams so you could have yours. And this is how you repay us. You lock us out in the street like stray dogs. I leaned closer to the monitor, staring at her tear-streaked face through the high-definition lens. The sheer magnitude of her delusion was almost impressive. She had repeated this lie to her friends, her neighbors, and herself for so many years that she had actually started to believe it. She truly believed she had been a self-sacrificing mother. But I always kept receipts. I had spent the last 5 years transforming myself into a woman who dealt exclusively in hard facts and undeniable proof. Susan, I said, my voice cutting through her theatrical sobbing with razor-sharp precision, I highly suggest you look directly at the digital display screen mounted on the intercom pedestal right below the call button. I am going to show you exactly what your sacrifices looked like. I opened a secure folder on my tablet, synced it to the gate system, and transmitted a series of high-resolution files directly to the outdoor screen. I watched the video feed as Susan and Thomas both leaned in, squinting at the bright display. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, his eyes darting across the documents illuminating the screen. "That, Thomas, is a digital copy of the $25,000 academic scholarship check I was awarded during my senior year of high school," I explained coldly. "The scholarship I earned by studying until my eyes bled while you were busy paying for Connor to attend parties. Look closely at the back of the check. That is the endorsement line. Notice anything interesting about the forged signature?" Susan suddenly took a sharp step back from the screen, her face draining of all color. "It is a forgery." I continued, my words striking like physical blows. "You intercepted my mail. You forged my signature on a federal banking document. You stole $25,000 of my hard-earned academic funding and deposited it directly into your own joint checking account." I swiped my tablet screen again, bringing up the next document on their display. But I did not just only track the deposit, I tracked the outbound transfer. Here's the bank ledger from the exact same week, and here's the corresponding receipt from the luxury boutique downtown. You took my scholarship money, the money meant to secure my future, and you used it to buy Connor a solid gold Rolex for his graduation present. You bought him a luxury watch to celebrate a business degree he barely scraped together with a minimum grade point average using funds stolen from your own daughter. The silence outside the gate was absolute. The truth was glaring at them in harsh white light, completely dismantling their carefully constructed narrative of parental sacrifice. "You absolutely did not pay for my tuition," I stated, my voice echoing relentlessly through the outdoor speakers. "You did not pay for my books or my housing or my meals. I paid for my own life. While Connor was wearing my scholarship on his wrist and attending fraternity formals on your dime, I was working 3 different night shift jobs just to keep from starving." I swiped the screen again, displaying my own brutal work schedule from those years. I worked as a waitress until midnight. I cleaned office buildings until 4 in the morning. I slept on a cold library floor for 2 hours before waking up to attend my morning lectures. I ate instant noodles for months on end. I fought through sheer physical exhaustion and mental burnout every single day while you bragged to your country club friends about how well Connor was doing. You never sacrificed a single penny for my education. You actively robbed me, and then you had the absolute audacity to claim credit for the success I built with my own blood and sweat. I stared at their frozen figures on the monitor. The documents remained glowing on the screen, a digital monument to their unforgivable greed. Susan opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to conjure another frantic lie, but the sheer weight of the federal felony displayed before her completely paralyzed her vocal cords. She clutched the collar of her beige sweater, her chest heaving as panic finally replaced her arrogance. Thomas glared at the camera lens, his fists clenched tight at his sides. His pride was shattered, replaced by the terrifying realization that I was no longer the silent victim they could manipulate. They had come here expecting me to simply surrender. Instead, I had presented them with undeniable evidence of their own criminal actions. I rested my hands on the marble counter. "You have absolutely nothing to say," I noted calmly. "Go ahead, make your next move. I dare you." Thomas did not hesitate. The revelation of the forged check had temporarily stunned him, but my direct challenge reignited his fury. He was a man who had spent his entire life controlling the narrative, using aggression to mask his incompetence. Confronted with undeniable proof of his own crimes, his response was not remorse or retreat. It was escalation. He pulled a sleek smartphone from his jacket pocket, his hands shaking slightly not from fear, but from raw, unadulterated rage. He glared directly into the security camera, his eyes wide as he punched in 3 numbers. He called emergency services at my front gate. Susan grabbed his arm, her eyes darting nervously toward the camera. Terrified, I might release the forgery documents. Thomas shoved her hand away roughly. He brought the phone to his ear and instantly transformed his entire demeanor. The angry, red-faced tyrant vanished. In his place stood a terrified, desperate, and deeply concerned father. "Yes, I need immediate assistance at a residence in Malibu," Thomas said into the phone, his voice trembling with perfectly manufactured panic. "My daughter Stella lives here. She is having a mental breakdown. She has a history of instability and is currently off her medication. She is financially abusing my wife and me, locking us out on the street, but that is not the worst part. Aaliyah is trapped inside the house with her. Stella is holding her hostage. We have not heard from her since yesterday, and Stella is completely unhinged. Please, you have to hurry before she hurts someone." He rattled off my address with practiced urgency, gave fabricated details about my violent history, and abruptly ended the call. The performance was chillingly flawless. He weaponized the police against me, using the dangers of a hostage situation to guarantee an overwhelming law enforcement response. Thomas lowered the phone and looked back at the security camera. The panicked father act dissolved instantly. A triumphant, arrogant smirk spread across his face, curling the corners of his mouth. He crossed his arms over his chest and nodded at the camera lens, fully believing he had just delivered the ultimate checkmate. "Did you hear that, Stella?" He taunted, his voice carrying clearly through the intercom microphone. "The police are on their way right now. They are responding to a hostage situation. We know how much you care about your corporate image and new lifestyle. You have built this entire fake persona to impress your wealthy neighbors and your high society business partners. The last thing you want is squad cars with flashing lights parked outside your mansion. The scandal will ruin you. Your company stock will tank by tomorrow morning." Susan seemed to catch on to his strategy. She straightened her beige sweater, wiping away the remnants of her tears. She stood taller, her confidence returning, as she mirrored his arrogant posture. She believed they had finally found the pressure point that would force me to submit. "Open the gate," Stella Susan demanded, her tone shifting to commanding. "Open the gate, let us inside and give us what we want. We can intercept the officers when they arrive. We will tell them it was just a misunderstanding, a minor family dispute that got out of hand. We can make this whole ugly situation go away quietly. If you keep this locked, the police will breach it. They will drag you out in handcuffs in front of everyone. Your reputation will be permanently destroyed. Do the smart thing and let us in." Inside the kitchen, I watched their smug faces on the high-definition monitor. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I did not feel the crushing anxiety they expected. I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. Thomas had just handed me the exact tool I needed to execute the next phase of my plan. He thought he was summoning my destruction, but he was actually arranging his own spectacular downfall. Alia strolled into the kitchen, wearing a comfortable silk robe over her clothes, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. She leaned against the marble island next to me, her eyes drifting toward the video feed. She let out a soft chuckle as she watched Thomas proudly dusting off his jacket, completely unaware of the reality of his situation. "Did he actually just call the police?" Aaliyah asked, taking a leisurely sip of her coffee. "He claimed I am having a mental breakdown and holding you hostage," I replied, my eyes locked on the monitor. "He expects me to panic and open the gates to avoid a public scandal. He thinks the threat of ruined reputation will force me to write him a check." Alia shook her head, a smile playing on her lips. "It is truly remarkable how little they know you. They still think you are that frightened 22-year-old girl they pushed around. They do not realize they are trying to play chess against a woman who owns the entire board. Should I go outside and wave to them so they know I am not bound and gagged?" "Not yet," I said, reaching for a thick leather-bound portfolio resting at the end of the counter. "Let them enjoy their false victory for a few more minutes. The higher they climb, the harder the impact will be when they hit the ground." I opened the portfolio and withdrew a specific set of documents, placing them carefully on the marble surface. They were crisp, official, and bore the heavy seals of the federal court system. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens began to cut through the peaceful morning air. The sound grew steadily louder, echoing down the coastal highway approaching my property. Outside the gate, Thomas and Susan exchanged a victorious look. Thomas stood tall, adjusting his tie, readying himself to play the desperate father for the arriving officers. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the polished iron bars of my security gate. Two patrol cruisers tore up the private coastal drive, their sirens cutting abruptly as they parked at aggressive angles, blocking the rented SUV. Four officers stepped out with practiced urgency. Their hands hovered near their duty belts, eyes scanning the perimeter. They were responding to a reported hostage situation, and their body language radiated high alert. Thomas rushed toward the lead officer. He threw his hands up in a gesture of desperate surrender, his face twisted into an expression of profound agony. He began his performance flawlessly, his voice cracking as he pointed toward my imposing property. He claimed he was a terrified father, his daughter had lost her mind, and his innocent daughter-in-law was trapped inside. Susan flanked him, letting out dramatic sobs. The lead officer held up a hand, instructing Thomas to step back. He signaled his partners to fan out along the perimeter wall. Before they could demand entry, a loud mechanical buzz resonated from the control panel. The heavy pedestrian door built into the main iron gate clicked and swung smoothly open. The officers tensed, bracing for the chaotic, unhinged woman Thomas described. Instead, I stepped out onto the sunlit pavement. I moved with absolute precision, my navy blue suit catching the morning light, my posture perfectly straight. I looked like a chief executive stepping into a routine board meeting. I held my digital tablet in my left hand and the thick leather portfolio I retrieved from the kitchen in my right. Behind me, stepping through the gate with effortless grace, was Aaliyah. She was still wearing her silk robe, her emerald dress visible underneath, calmly stirring her coffee with a silver spoon. She took a sip, looking at the assembled police officers, with a polite, inquisitive expression. The visual contradiction was absolute. There was no hostage. There was no crisis. There were simply two highly successful women dealing with a morning nuisance. Thomas and Susan froze, their dramatic weeping instantly evaporating. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but the lead officer stepped forward, his hand dropping away from his belt as he assessed the calm reality in front of him. He looked from me to Aaliyah, then back to my parents, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "Officer, my name is Stella." I stated, my voice projecting clear authority. "I am the sole owner of this property. The man claiming I am holding someone against their will is my estranged father, Thomas. The woman standing next to me is Aaliyah. As you can plainly see, she is neither bound nor distressed." Aaliyah smiled warmly at the officer, raising her coffee mug in a casual salute. "I am perfectly fine, officer," she confirmed, her tone completely steady. "I am a forensic auditor, and I am currently employed as the chief financial investigator for Aegis Holdings, Stella's firm. I am a guest in her home by my own choice. My father-in-law filed a false emergency report because Stella refused to let him inside to demand money." The lead officer turned a hard glare toward Thomas, whose face suddenly drained of its arrogant color. "Filing a false police report regarding a hostage situation is a severe criminal offense," the officer warned, his tone hardening. Thomas stammered frantically, trying to salvage his ruined narrative. He pointed a trembling finger at me, claiming Aaliyah was lying, claiming I had brainwashed her, insisting that I was still a dangerous threat to the family. I did not let him finish his desperate rant. I walked directly up to the lead officer and handed him my digital tablet, the screen illuminated and unlocked. "I am not the threat here," I explained calmly. "I spent the last 5 years building an independent life to escape their financial and emotional abuse. When I stopped paying their debts, I disappeared to protect myself. But I did not just run away. I went through the proper legal channels. Please look at the document displayed on that screen. It is a permanent, active federal restraining order. It was signed by a federal judge exactly 5 years ago. It legally prohibits Thomas, Susan, and my brother Connor from coming within 500 feet of me, my residence, or my business." They are currently standing on my driveway, which is private property, in direct violation of a federal mandate. The officer took the tablet, his eyes scanning the official judicial seals and explicit mandates outlined in the text. He scrolled down to verify the names and the active status of the injunction. As he read the specific clauses detailing a documented history of extortion and financial exploitation, his posture shifted entirely. He handed the tablet back to me and signaled his partners. The officers immediately closed the distance between themselves and my parents, positioning themselves to block any escape. Susan let out a sharp gasp, stumbling backward against the rented vehicle. Thomas tried to step away, raising his hands, his previous arrogance extinguished by the terrifying reality of law enforcement turning against him. "But I am not finished," I continued, my voice unwavering. "Yesterday morning their son Connor arrived at this exact gate. He managed to force his way inside my foyer. When he realized Aaliyah was working for me and discovered we had evidence of his corporate embezzlement, he became violent." I tapped the screen of my tablet, switching the display from the restraining order to the high-definition security footage captured in my living room. I held it up for the lead officer to see. The crisp video showed Connor roaring in anger, lunging aggressively toward Aaliyah, and attempting to physically attack us before my private security team intercepted him and pinned him to the wall. "This family is not here out of parental concern," I stated, locking eyes with the lead officer. "They are here to intimidate, harass, and extort money from me because their son is facing federal indictment and they are bankrupt. They bypassed my security gate, trespassed on my property, violated a permanent restraining order, and weaponized emergency services by faking a hostage crisis just to force me out of my home. The evidence is all right there." The lead officer nodded slowly, his jaw set in a tight professional line. He turned his attention fully away from me and focused entirely on Thomas, reaching for the metal handcuffs resting securely on his duty belt. The metal handcuffs caught the bright morning sunlight as the lead officer unclipped them from his heavy duty belt. He stepped purposefully toward Thomas, closing the final few feet between them. Thomas stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes scraping clumsily against the asphalt drive. He raised his hands, shaking his head in frantic denial, his arrogant facade completely shattered by the metallic clink of the cuffs preparing to lock. He realized too late that his carefully constructed lie had failed. The authority he tried to project was gone. He was nothing but a criminal caught in the act here today. Thomas protested loudly, insisting there had been a massive misunderstanding, that he was a highly respected member of the community, that his daughter was lying to them. The officer was completely unmoved by the theatrical performance. He grabbed Thomas by the right wrist, twisted his arm smoothly behind his back, and secured the first steel cuff. Thomas let out a sharp gasp, his body instinctively flinching away from the freezing cold metal biting into his skin. The officer swiftly grabbed his other arm, bringing it back to meet the first, and the second cuff snapped shut with absolute loud finality. Susan shrieked violently. It was not her usual theatrical cry meant to garner immediate sympathy from country club friends. This was a genuine high-pitched scream of absolute terror. She lunged forward aggressively, her hands reaching out as if she could physically pull her husband away from the armed officers. Two other patrolmen instantly stepped into her path, holding up their hands firmly to block her sudden advance. They warned her loudly to step back immediately, ordering her to remain by the rented vehicle or face immediate arrest herself for actively interfering with a police officer during an active arrest. Susan froze instantly, trembling violently where she stood. Her beige cashmere sweater slipped off one shoulder as she covered her mouth with both hands, sobbing uncontrollably into her palms. The lead officer began reciting the Miranda rights loudly, his voice a steady rhythmic drumbeat of impending doom for my father. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited clearly, steering Thomas roughly toward the nearest parked squad car. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Thomas was hyperventilating, now his chest heaving rapidly, his face a sickly pale gray color. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with a potent mixture of absolute shock and sheer panic. He begged me to tell the police to stop, pleading desperately that we were family, that he would leave my property immediately and never come back if I just let him go free today. I stood my ground firmly, my arms resting casually at my sides. I offered him no comfort, no verbal reassurance, and absolutely no mercy whatsoever. The time for familial compromises and unearned forgiveness had officially expired exactly 5 long years ago when they ruined my life. The lead officer opened the back door of the police cruiser and guided Thomas firmly inside. He placed a heavy hand on top of his lowered head, pressing him downward so he would safely clear the metal door frame, and shoved him onto the hard plastic seat in the back of the official vehicle. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut loudly, sealing Thomas securely inside a cage he could not verbally manipulate or financially buy his way out of today. I turned my head slightly to the left and looked directly at Aaliyah standing peacefully beside me holding her morning coffee. She offered a small, deeply approving nod of solidarity. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the front of my tailored navy blazer, and began walking slowly toward the parked police cruiser. The armed officers watched me approach carefully, but did absolutely nothing to stop my forward progress. They completely understood that I was the undeniable victim here, the lawful homeowner securing her legal boundaries against hostile intruders. Susan continued to weep loudly against the side of the rented black vehicle, too paralyzed by her own sudden fear and mounting legal exposure to intervene in my long walk forward today. I stopped right next to the rear passenger window of the running squad car. Thomas was slumped sideways on the uncomfortable seat, his hands bound tightly behind his back, looking up at me through the thick, reinforced glass. The window was rolled down just a tiny crack, allowing the cool ocean breeze to filter into the stifling interior of the police vehicle. He pressed his sweaty face near the small opening, his rapid breathing fogging the glass immediately. "Stella, please," he whispered frantically through the narrow gap, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming, arrogant parental authority right now. "You thought I would be frightened of a public scandal and stop you from moving your luggage into my guest rooms," I stated softly, my words perfectly measured and lethally precise. "You actually thought you could use my hard-earned resources to save your precious suburban mansion from the terrible debt you created now." I leaned in very close, bringing my face just inches from the cracked window glass. "By the way, that suburban house you are trying to save. My firm, Aegis Holdings, bought the distressed mortgage from the bank yesterday. You have 30 days to vacate my property." Thomas gasped loudly, his entire body jerking helplessly against the tight metal handcuffs restricting his arms. The remaining color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost, trapped forever behind the thick glass. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling desperately to form words that stubbornly refused to come. I stepped back from the squad car, gracefully straightening my impeccable posture. I did not wait for his pathetic response. I simply turned on my heel and walked away. The lead police officer climbed into the driver's seat, started the powerful engine, and drove away fast. I stood on my driveway for a few moments, watching the squad car disappear around the coastal bend. Susan was left completely alone, trembling next to the mountain of designer luggage she had so confidently packed for a permanent stay. She stared at the empty road, her hands clutching her beige sweater, entirely incapable of processing how rapidly her luxurious invasion had collapsed into a humiliating arrest. I did not offer her a ride. I did not offer her a phone. I turned around, walked back through my secure iron gate, and let it click firmly shut behind me. I returned to my kitchen, picked up my now lukewarm coffee, and resumed my morning routine, as if the trash had simply taken itself out. 3 days passed in absolute silence from my family. Behind the scenes, however, I knew exactly what was happening, because Aaliyah monitored their financial footprint with ruthless precision. Thomas sat in a holding cell for 72 hours, furiously demanding that his son fix the situation. Connor, paralyzed by his own impending legal disasters and terrified of drawing attention to his empty bank accounts, initially refused to help. The reality of their new financial ruin finally set in. To secure his father a release, Connor forced Susan to liquidate her very last retirement account. He drained the small emergency fund she had kept hidden for years, wiping out the final safety net they possessed, just to post bail. They were now completely destitute, living on borrowed time in a suburban house I legally owned. Desperation breeds dangerous creativity. Realizing they could no longer intimidate me in person or defeat me legally, they pivoted to the only arena where they still felt powerful. They decided to manipulate public perception. On the fourth morning, Alia walked into my home office holding a sleek tablet. She did not say a word. She simply placed the device on my desk and tapped the screen. The video buffered for a second before filling the display with the bright, aggressive graphics of a highly rated Los Angeles daytime talk show, a program notorious for sensationalizing family drama and manufacturing viral outrage. Sitting on the brightly lit studio stage, bathed in flattering, sympathetic lighting, were Susan and Connor. Susan wore a modest dark dress, completely discarding her usual flashy country club attire to play the role of the humble, heartbroken mother. Connor sat close beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders, projecting the image of a devoted, grieving son. The host, a woman famous for her dramatic gasps and probing questions, leaned forward with an expression of intense, manufactured empathy. I sat back in my leather office chair, resting my chin on my steepled fingers, and watched the performance unfold. Susan began to speak, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed sorrow. She looked directly into the studio cameras, tears welling in her eyes precisely on cue. She told the millions of viewers watching at home that her family was being systematically destroyed by a ruthless sociopathic monster. She claimed that her daughter, the child she had supposedly sacrificed everything to raise, had turned into a cold-blooded corporate predator. "My heart breaks every single day," Susan sobbed, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. "We loved her so much. We gave her everything we had. But the money changed her. The wealth turned her into someone we do not even recognize anymore. She has completely cut us out of her life, and now she is trying to leave her own elderly parents homeless on the streets." The studio audience gasped in synchronized horror. The host shook her head, placing a comforting hand on Susan's knee. Connor immediately seized his opportunity to elevate the tragedy. He leaned toward the microphone, his handsome face twisted into a mask of righteous indignation and profound loss. "It is not just about the money," Connor added, his voice thick with fake emotion. "Stella is actively trying to destroy my marriage. She manipulated my wife, Aaliyah. She brainwashed her, isolating her from me, and convinced her to abandon our home. My sister is vindictive, unstable, and obsessed with ruining our lives because she always felt jealous of the love my parents gave me. She is using her massive wealth to bully us to buy our family home, just to evict my parents out of pure, malicious spite." Alia let out a sharp, amused laugh from her spot across my office. "Brainwashed," she repeated, shaking her head. "He really thinks my departure was the result of a magical spell, rather than the natural consequence of discovering his massive illegal gambling debts and multiple offshore embezzlement schemes. His ego literally cannot comprehend that I left him because he is a criminal." I kept my eyes locked on the screen. Susan was now weeping openly, recounting a heavily edited version of the incident at my security gate. She conveniently omitted the forged scholarship check, the physical assault Connor attempted, and the permanent federal restraining order. Instead, she painted a picture of two desperate, loving parents who just wanted to hug their daughter, only to be met with armed guards and cruel police intervention orchestrated by a billionaire tyrant. "She is a monster," Susan cried out, her voice echoing through the television speakers. "She has no heart, no soul, and no conscience. I do not know how I will survive the winter if she throws us out of the only home we have ever known." The host turned to the camera, delivering a dramatic monologue about elder abuse and the corrupting nature of corporate greed, promising to follow this developing story closely. The segment ended with a freeze frame of Susan weeping on Connor's shoulder. Aaliyah reached over and turned off the tablet. The screen went black, plunging my office back into quiet tranquility. "They are attempting to destroy your entire business now," Aaliyah observed, her tone devoid of panic but laced with sharp professional interest. "The television interview was just the opening salvo. Connor knows that public sympathy will only carry them so far. He needs to cripple your operational capacity before the federal investigators fully untangle his own financial crimes. He is fighting a war of attrition, and he expects you to bleed capital until you surrender." I nodded, turning my chair to face the sprawling view of the ocean. My brother was a predictable creature. When backed into a corner, he always resorted to sabotage. He lacked the intelligence to build a legitimate defense, so he would naturally attempt to drag my reputation down into the mud alongside his own. I expected a counterattack, but I severely underestimated the sheer desperation driving his next move. Less than 48 hours after their tearful television performance, the first alarms triggered within my corporate infrastructure. I was reviewing acquisition targets when my lead compliance officer routed an urgent high-priority alert directly to my secure terminal. One of our primary operational shell companies, a holding entity we use specifically to purchase distressed commercial real estate debt, had been abruptly frozen. A hard, unyielding lock had been placed on over $8 million of liquid capital. I immediately initiated a trace. The freeze had not been executed by any federal regulatory agency or state authority. It had been triggered internally from the routing desk of a mid-tier investment bank in Los Angeles. It was the exact same bank where Connor held his executive position. Despite the looming federal indictment, the internal bureaucracy of his firm had been agonizingly slow. He had not yet been formally stripped of his system credentials because he was technically out on bail and fighting the charges. He had exploited that brief chaotic administrative delay to log into his executive terminal one last time. He used his remaining clearance to flag my company account for suspicious activity, effectively paralyzing a massive chunk of my operating capital. It was a stunningly reckless move. Connor was leaving a blatant digital footprint tying his name directly to a fraudulent administrative action. He no longer cared about the long-term consequences. He only cared about causing immediate catastrophic damage to my firm. He wanted to starve me of the funds I needed to finalize the acquisition of his failed real estate ventures. But freezing the bank account was only the first phase of his aggressive assault. Connor understood that financial freezes could be fought with corporate lawyers, so he simultaneously launched a vicious, coordinated attack on my public reputation. He utilized the offshore proxy servers he had previously used for his gambling debts to distribute a series of anonymous, highly detailed tips to several prominent financial gossip blogs and industry news websites. The forged documents he leaked were maliciously clever. They mixed publicly available data about Aegis Holdings with entirely fabricated ledgers. The narrative he pushed was explosive. He claimed that my firm was nothing more than a sophisticated money laundering front designed to wash illegal offshore funds through the acquisition of distressed American real estate. He spun a compelling fiction that my rapid rise in the financial sector was funded by illicit overseas syndicates. The financial blogs, always hungry for a sensational story involving a young, wealthy female executive, published the rumors almost instantly. Within hours, the articles began circulating rapidly across social media and professional networking platforms. The narrative fit perfectly with the sob story my parents had sold on national television. I was no longer just a cruel daughter evicting her elderly parents. I was a ruthless corporate criminal building an empire on dirty money. The impact was immediate and incredibly disruptive. Trust is the absolute currency of the financial sector, and Connor had successfully injected a massive dose of toxic doubt into my business ecosystem. My phone began ringing nonstop with frantic calls from legal advisors and public relations managers. But the real damage materialized later that afternoon. Two of my minor corporate clients' companies that relied heavily on maintaining spotless public images panicked. They requested an emergency video conference. When I logged on, their executives looked incredibly nervous. They cited the sudden swirl of negative press and the frozen holding account as material breaches of their trust. They informed me that they were legally invoking the morality clauses in our contracts. They threatened to pull their accounts entirely by the end of the business day if I could not provide immediate, irrefutable proof that the money laundering allegations were entirely false. Losing those two contracts would not bankrupt Aegis Holdings, but it would create a dangerous domino effect. If the industry saw clients fleeing my firm, larger partners might follow suit. Connor was attempting to trigger a full-scale corporate bank run. I closed the video conference interface and sat in the quiet of my office. The stress was supposed to be crushing. I was supposed to be frantically calling crisis management teams, begging my clients to stay, or perhaps even reaching out to Connor to negotiate a ceasefire. That was exactly what he expected. He wanted me to feel the same suffocating pressure he felt when the police arrived at my gate. Alia walked into my office holding a fresh stack of digital printouts. She dropped them onto my desk, her expression perfectly composed. "Two clients are threatening to walk," I told her, my voice betraying no emotion. "Connor locked out $8 million in capital and leaked forged documents to the press. He is trying to orchestrate a complete systemic collapse." Aaliyah smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that matched my own internal resolve. "It is a bold strategy," she admitted, taking a seat across from me. "But it relies entirely on the assumption that we are going to play defensively. He thinks you will fight his bank to unfreeze accounts. We are completely going on offense." I stood up and followed Aaliyah down the hallway to the secure server room I had constructed when I first purchased the estate. It was a climate-controlled vault, packed with high-speed processors, cooling towers, and multiple encrypted network terminals. This was my tactical operations center, and right now, it was Aaliyah's domain. She sat down in the primary ergonomic chair, her fingers flying across the glowing mechanical keyboard with blistering speed. The large monitors mounted on the wall flared to life, displaying cascading rows of financial data, server logs, and banking compliance protocols. Connor made a fatal miscalculation when he used his corporate terminal to freeze your holding account. Aaliyah stated, her dark eyes locked intensely on the center screen. He acted out of pure panic. Panic creates blind spots, and blind spots leave enormous digital footprints. I stood behind her, watching the rapid flow of information illuminate her focused face. He was trying to buy time, I noted. He wanted to bleed my capital dry before his own federal indictment formally hit the public record. He wanted me playing defense. Alia let out a sharp scoff. He has always underestimated the women in his life. He assumed because he clicked a button on an executive dashboard the money was permanently locked away. He forgot that I spent the last 7 years auditing the exact security architecture his bank uses to enforce those freezes. Her fingers danced across the keys, entering a complex series of commands. She accessed a highly restricted compliance portal, leveraging a backdoor loophole she had discovered during her tenure as a forensic auditor. The freeze Connor initiated was an internal administrative hold, Aaliyah explained, never breaking her intense focus. It was not a federal injunction or a legal mandate. It was essentially a corporate timeout. Because his employment status is currently flagged under criminal review, his administrative clearance is actually suspended in the secondary compliance tier. He pushed the freeze through the primary system, but he lacked the authorization to seal it at the compliance level. She executed a final keystroke. The screen flashed bright green. A notification popped up confirming that the $8 million in my holding account was now fully unlocked. I did not just remove his administrative hold, Alia added with a satisfied smirk. I initiated an automated transfer. Your capital is currently routing through 3 different secure proxy accounts and depositing directly into a protected offshore trust that his bank cannot even see, let alone touch. The immediate financial threat was completely neutralized in less than 15 minutes. The capital I needed to purchase his failing real estate project was safe and ready to deploy. But we were not finished. Alia immediately opened a new terminal window, pivoting her attack toward the forged documents Connor had leaked to the financial gossip blogs. I need to trace the origin of those money laundering rumors, I instructed her. If we cannot prove he manufactured those tips, my corporate clients will terminate their contracts by the end of the day. Alia was already 2 steps ahead of me. She ran a reverse trace on the metadata embedded in the files the blogs had published. Connor thought he was being a genius by using a virtual private network to mask his location, Alia said, shaking her head at his sheer incompetence. He routed his connection through a server in Eastern Europe to send those emails to the press. But he is a creature of habit. He used the exact same encrypted proxy network he always uses to access his illegal overseas sports betting accounts. I stared at the screen as lines of code translated into undeniable proof. He did not scrub the document properties either. Alia continued pulling up the hidden file data. The author tag on the original file clearly displays his personal workstation identification number. He literally stamped his own digital signature on the forged documents before leaking them. He handed us the smoking gun. We now possessed absolute proof that Connor was the sole architect of the smear campaign. I could instantly clear my name and salvage my client relationships. However, Alia was not done digging. Her eyes suddenly narrowed, picking up on a strange anomaly buried deep within the network routing data she had just extracted. "Wait," she whispered, her hands pausing over the keyboard. "That proxy server he used to send the emails. It is bouncing traffic back to a secondary node in the Cayman Islands. I know that routing pattern." She began typing furiously again, pulling up a new database and cross-referencing the network addresses. Her breath hitched slightly. "Stella, look at this." I leaned closer to the monitor. Aaliyah had just breached a hidden financial gateway. She bypassed the security protocols of an offshore banking institution and pulled up a private ledger. "This is not his gambling debt," Aaliyah stated, her voice dropping to a serious, calculated tone. "These are the master accounts. I isolated the exact offshore repositories where Connor has been hiding the money he embezzled from his clients. This is the $1.2 million the federal investigators have been desperately trying to locate for weeks. Connor thought he had buried the stolen funds so deeply that no one would ever find them. But by using the same network to launch his petty attack against me, he had accidentally handed his brilliant wife the keys to his darkest financial vault. We did not just have proof of his slander anymore. We held the undisputed, irrefutable evidence of his federal crimes. I looked at the glowing numbers on the screen, feeling a cold, righteous satisfaction settle into my bones. "Download every single byte of that data," I commanded softly. "Compile the forgery proofs and the offshore ledgers into a single unsealed federal court dossier." Aaliyah smiled, her fingers already flying across the keyboard to execute the final commands. "We are filing this dossier right now today." The submission sequence initiated with a single keystroke. Aaliyah watched the loading bar race across her monitor, connecting to the Federal Electronic Court Records System. The massive compilation of forged routing logs, offshore bank accounts, and proof of financial crimes embedded itself into the public domain. It was completely unsealed. Anyone could now view the absolute truth of my brother and his actions. We sat back, sipping fresh coffee, and turned our attention to the television screen mounted on the wall. The timing was flawless. Across the city, inside a television studio, the cameras began rolling for the sequel to my family's public pity party. The talk show host sat in her armchair, her face arranged in an expression of manufactured sorrow. Directly opposite her sat my mother, Susan, wearing another drab outfit chosen to project financial distress. Connor sat close beside his mother, his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders, playing the valiant son, defending his fragile family from a corporate monster. They looked confident, unaware that the foundation of their false narrative had just been legally vaporized. "Welcome back," the host intoned, speaking directly into the camera lens with a solemn nod. "Yesterday we heard the tragic story of parents facing imminent eviction at the hands of their own billionaire daughter. Today, Susan and Connor are back to share how this family betrayal has escalated overnight. Susan, how are you holding up during this unimaginable nightmare?" Susan did not miss a beat. She reached for a tissue, dabbing at her dry eyes. "It is getting worse every single hour," she cried, her voice trembling with practiced grief. "We received a formal eviction notice yesterday. Stella is throwing us out into the street. She has no heart left. The corporate world has corrupted her soul. We just want our loving daughter back, but she only cares about power and money now. It is a nightmare no parent should endure." Connor leaned toward his microphone, projecting an aura of righteous anger mixed with exhaustion. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world. He adjusted his expensive tie, a reminder of the executive status he was desperately trying to cling to. "My sister is out of control," Connor added, shaking his head slowly for the cameras. "She is using her wealth to bully us. She orchestrated a smear campaign against my investment firm this morning, trying to ruin my reputation just because I stood up for our parents. I am terrified of what she might do next." The studio audience murmured in synchronized sympathy. The host opened her mouth to ask another probing question, ready to fuel the manufactured outrage. However, a sudden flurry of movement off-camera caught her attention. A senior producer rushed onto the live set, breaking every protocol of daytime television broadcasting. He sprinted across the floor holding a digital tablet and a stack of freshly printed papers. He ignored the rolling cameras, stepping directly in front of the host and shoving the tablet into her hands. The host looked annoyed for a fraction of a second before her professional instincts took over. She glanced down at the screen, her eyes scanning the urgent text displayed there. The live broadcast hung in an awkward, heavy silence. Susan froze mid-sob, her tissue hovering near her face. Connor stiffened his protective grip on his mother, looking rigid and tense. They both sensed the immediate shift in the atmosphere, the sudden absence of the unconditional sympathy they had been enjoying moments before. The host read the screen for 10 agonizing seconds. Her eyes widened dramatically. The mask of empathetic sorrow vanished, completely replaced by the sharp, predatory gaze of a journalist who had just been handed the scoop of the century. She looked up from the tablet, staring directly at Connor. The silence in the studio became utterly deafening. The audience stopped murmuring. The cameramen zoomed in tight on Connor's confused, paling face. "I am sorry to interrupt you, Susan," the host said, her voice completely devoid of its previous warmth. Her tone was now sharp, calculating, and dangerously precise. "We have just received some breaking news that directly impacts the story you are telling us today. This information was legally filed in federal court exactly 5 minutes ago and has instantly become public record." Connor swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly on the high-definition broadcast. "What kind of information?" he asked, his voice betraying a faint, high-pitched squeak of rising panic. The host held up the printed papers the producer had handed her. "It appears to be an unsealed federal court dossier," she announced, holding the documents toward the camera. "It was filed by a certified forensic auditor named Aaliyah, who I believe is your wife, Connor. Is that correct?" Connor nodded mechanically, unable to form a coherent verbal response. His face turned a sickly shade of gray. Susan looked wildly between the host and her son, completely lost, entirely unaware of the catastrophic trap that had just snapped shut around them. "This dossier is fascinating." The host continued, turning her gaze back to the papers. "It contains a comprehensive financial report regarding your activities at your investment bank. According to these federal documents, you did not just lose your wife, Connor. You are facing federal indictment for corporate embezzlement. The files allege you stole over $1 million from your clients to cover illegal offshore gambling debts. Furthermore, this dossier contains digital proof that you personally forged the money laundering allegations against your sister's firm using a proxy server." Susan let out a gasp of horror. She dropped her tissue, staring at her golden child in shock. Connor was paralyzed. The protective brother routine shattered on live television. He opened his mouth trying to formulate a lie, but his brain short-circuited. He looked frantically at the exit doors, realizing he was permanently trapped on this stage, with absolutely nowhere left to hide from his catastrophic, massive public downfall right now. Connor, the host, pressed her voice, slicing through the dead silence of the studio. "I am going to ask you one more time. Can you explain the $1.2 million missing from your clients' portfolios?" The cameras pushed in closer, capturing every bead of sweat forming on his forehead. He opened his mouth, but only a dry sound escaped. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit or any miraculous intervention that would save him from this live execution. There was no escape. Susan, completely oblivious to the financial realities of her son, tried to intervene. She patted his knee, looking at the host with anger and desperate confusion. "This is absurd," Susan declared. "My son is a highly respected executive. He would never steal. Stella fabricated these ridiculous documents just to ruin him because she is jealous. You should be investigating her, not interrogating my boy." The host did not look at Susan. Her eyes remained locked on Connor, her expression hardening into a mask of pure journalistic triumph. She looked down at the tablet in her hands, reading directly from the forensic audit. "These documents were not provided by your sister, Connor," the host stated coldly. "As I mentioned, these were legally filed by your wife, an expert financial investigator. She meticulously traced your routing numbers. The host read the specific offshore account names aloud on national television, listing the exact dates and times he transferred stolen client capital to illegal overseas sports betting syndicates. Each word was a nail in his coffin. Connor physically shrank backward into his chair, collapsing inward as the undeniable truth of his federal crimes was broadcast to millions. His brilliant wife had handed the media the undisputed blueprints of his massive corporate embezzlement. Before Connor could attempt a pathetic denial, a sudden voice crackled through the host's earpiece. The host paused, pressing two fingers against her ear to listen to her producer. Her eyes widened slightly, a genuine reaction that broke through her polished television persona. She looked up, her gaze shifting past Connor and Susan to the massive digital monitor mounted on the back wall. "I am receiving an update from our news desk," the host announced, her voice rising with intense urgency. "We are going to cut away from the studio feed. We have breaking news coming in live from downtown Los Angeles." The camera feed switched instantly. The close-up of Connor's terrified face was replaced by a wide overhead shot captured from a news helicopter. The camera zoomed in on a towering skyscraper in the heart of the financial district. It was the exact building where Connor's investment bank was located. The street-level view was pure chaotic spectacle. A dozen black unmarked federal SUVs were parked at sharp angles, completely barricading the main entrance. Dozens of agents wearing dark tactical gear with bold yellow letters spelling FBI swarmed the pristine marble courtyard, pushing past panicked security guards and rushing directly into the glass lobby. The broadcast split into a dual-screen presentation. The left side showed federal agents actively raiding the corporate headquarters, already carrying out boxes filled with hard drives and confiscated financial records. The right side showed the live reaction inside the studio. Connor stared at the massive monitor, his face completely devoid of any remaining color. The federal indictment he thought he had delayed was no longer looming in the distant future. It was happening right now, in real-time broadcast for the entire world to witness. Aaliyah had not just filed the dossier with the court, she had also tipped off the federal task force regarding the hidden servers. The sheer gravity of his absolute destruction finally registered. The arrogant golden boy completely snapped. Connor leaped out of his armchair with such explosive force that the furniture tipped backward and crashed onto the polished studio floor. He grabbed the small black wire of his lavalier microphone and ripped it violently from his lapel. The microphone snapped, sending a loud crackle of static feedback echoing painfully through the speakers. He did not look at his mother. He did not offer a single word of apology to the woman who had just drained her final retirement account to pay his bail. Connor turned his back on the cameras, shoved past a stunned production assistant, and sprinted frantically towards the heavy exit doors at the rear. Susan was left sitting entirely alone under the harsh, glaring studio lights. She stared at the empty space where her precious son had been sitting just seconds prior, her mind utterly incapable of processing his sudden cowardly abandonment. She looked up at the split screen, watching the federal agent storming the bank, and then looked at the host who was calmly narrating Connor's live televised escape. Susan's fragile grip on reality shattered into a million pieces. She jumped to her feet, waving her arms wildly in the air. "Turn the cameras off right now!" Susan shrieked, her voice cracking as she lunged aggressively toward the nearest cameraman. "You are ruining my family! Cut the feed!" She screamed hysterically, completely unhinged, demanding that the production crew stop filming her ultimate humiliation. The camera simply zoomed in closer, capturing her epic meltdown in pristine high definition. Back in my secure climate-controlled server room, Aaliyah and I sat in perfect uninterrupted silence. We watched the dual screen monitor on my wall as Susan continued to shriek and rage against the impassive television crew. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my fresh coffee. The taste was absolute perfection. Aaliyah leaned back in her ergonomic chair, a sharp, victorious smile spreading across her beautiful face. She reached over and gently tapped her coffee mug against mine. The crisp, clear chime of the porcelain meeting echoed softly in the quiet room. We had not just defeated them, we had successfully engineered their complete public annihilation without ever leaving the absolute comfort of my coastal estate. Weeks passed. and the crushing reality of their new existence settled over my parents and my brother like a suffocating shroud. The glamorous suburban life my mother had desperately clung to was completely obliterated. Her country club friends blocked her phone number. The prestigious charity boards she used to chair publicly expelled her, citing the severe reputational damage her family had caused. She was a pariah confined to a house that she legally did not even own anymore. The 30-day eviction clock I had placed on their suburban mansion was loudly ticking down to zero, leaving them paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their impending homelessness. Connor was in an even worse predicament. Federal authorities had arrested him, booked him, and dragged him through a deeply humiliating arraignment process. He was currently out on bail, but only because his parents managed to liquidate a forgotten low-yield life insurance policy just to keep him out of a holding cell. He was wearing an ankle monitor, confined to the state, and facing a massive federal indictment carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. The public defender assigned to his case had taken one look at Aaliyah's flawless forensic audit and bluntly advised Connor to plead guilty. The evidence was absolutely insurmountable. Connor, however, was still drowning in his delusional arrogance. He refused to accept defeat. He insisted that if he could just hire an elite criminal defense attorney, he could beat the federal charges. But elite defense attorneys require massive, non-refundable retainers paid entirely in cash. Connor had zero cash. His bank accounts were seized, his assets frozen, and his reputation was radioactive. Their absolute last shred of hope rested on a colossal, failing commercial real estate project located on the outskirts of Los Angeles. 5 years ago, during the peak of his arrogant success, Connor had convinced Thomas to co-sign a massive commercial mortgage to purchase an abandoned shopping center. They planned to demolish the site and build a luxury retail complex. It was supposed to be the crowning achievement of their patriarchal legacy, proof that the men in the family were brilliant business moguls. Instead, the project became a catastrophic money pit. Environmental zoning issues, endless construction delays, and terrible mismanagement drained their capital. The site was currently a barren, fenced-off wasteland, bleeding thousands of dollars in property taxes and high-interest debt every single month. It was a toxic asset that no sane investor wanted to touch. Thomas and Connor spent the last 3 weeks desperately calling every contact, every former business partner, and every predatory lender they could find, begging someone to buy the property. They offered it at a massive loss, hoping to walk away with enough liquid capital to cover Connor's legal fees and secure a modest apartment for Susan. Every single call ended in a harsh rejection. The corporate world had watched Connor self-destruct on live television. No one was willing to do business with a known embezzler facing imminent federal incarceration. The atmosphere inside their suburban house was completely toxic. The electricity was scheduled to be shut off by the end of the week. Susan spent her days weeping in the dark living room, mourning her lost social status. Thomas and Connor sat in the home office staring at a stack of final default notices, blaming each other for their total financial ruin. The tension between the two men was explosive, fueled by the terrifying realization that they had completely run out of options. They were trapped, waiting for federal prosecutors and eviction enforcement teams to arrive and finish the job. Then a miracle seemingly fell directly from the sky. Late on a Tuesday night, a sharp notification chime broke the heavy silence in the dark office. Thomas glanced at his computer monitor. An email had just arrived in his inbox, bypassing the spam filters. The sender was an entity named Apex Capital, listed as a private, aggressive New York hedge fund, known for acquiring distressed commercial assets. Thomas clicked the email open, his eyes scanning the corporate letterhead and the attached legal proposals. His breath hitched in his throat. He grabbed Connor by the shoulder, shaking him violently, pointing at the glowing screen. Apex Capital was offering to purchase the failed shopping center project immediately. The terms laid out in the email were incredibly aggressive, but they were an absolute lifeline. The hedge fund proposed buying the barren property, assuming 100% of the associated toxic commercial debts, and providing a final cash payout to the sellers. The payout was severely undervalued compared to their original investment, but it was exactly enough to cover the massive legal retainer Connor desperately needed to avoid federal prison. The proposal guaranteed an expedited closing process, promising to wire the funds within 48 hours of a signed agreement. Connor shoved Thomas aside, reading the email himself, his hands shaking with euphoric relief. He let out a loud, victorious laugh. He believed his business acumen had attracted a heavy-hitting Wall Street savior. He believed he was outsmarting the system once again. Neither Thomas nor Connor stopped to question why an elite New York hedge fund would suddenly express intense interest in a worthless piece of California real estate owned by a publicly disgraced criminal. They were blinded by desperation and arrogance. They eagerly hit reply, accepting the initial terms and requesting an immediate in-person meeting to sign the final contracts. They thought Apex Capital was their salvation. They had no idea they were enthusiastically sprinting directly into my final inescapable trap today. Their ignorance was truly stunning to witness, confirming they had learned absolutely nothing from their spectacular catastrophic downfall, which made my incoming absolute victory flawless. Before Connor could even step foot into that highly anticipated boardroom to sign away his commercial real estate nightmare, he had to survive a much more immediate legal execution. Aaliyah had scheduled their mandatory divorce mediation for the morning prior to his supposed massive payout. She chose a neutral but heavily fortified legal clinic in downtown Los Angeles, bringing her absolute best corporate litigators. These were not standard family law attorneys. These were vicious, cold-blooded corporate sharks who specialized in dissecting fraudulent marital assets. Connor arrived at the clinic looking visibly exhausted, but radiating a nauseating layer of false confidence. He genuinely believed that because he had secured the Apex Capital deal, he could simply swat Aaliyah away like a minor inconvenience. He strutted into the mediation room, pulling out a chair across from his soon-to-be ex-wife, completely failing to recognize the legal firing squad assembled around her. Aaliyah wore a stunning crimson power suit, looking entirely unbothered as she organized negotiations. It began with an absolute slaughter. Aaliyah's lead attorney, a ruthless woman named Brenda, opened a heavy binder and began listing every single financial crime Connor had committed during their brief marriage. Brenda laid out the exact dates Connor had secretly funneled joint marital funds into his offshore gambling accounts. She presented the forged compliance documents he had used to mask his theft from both his employer and his own household. Under California law, hiding marital assets and committing financial fraud to deliberately drain joint accounts is considered a massive breach of fiduciary duty between spouses. The legal penalty for such profound financial deception is devastating, and Aaliyah's team leveraged it with surgical precision. They did not ask for a traditional 50-50 split. They demanded a punitive division of assets heavily weighted to penalize his verified undeniable criminal behavior. Brenda slid the proposed settlement agreement across the long table. The terms were brutally simple and mathematically flawless. Aaliyah legally stripped him of exactly 50% of every single clean, legitimate asset they possessed. She claimed half of the remaining equity in their primary residence, half of his legitimate retirement accounts, and ownership of his luxury sports car, which he had foolishly put in her name for tax purposes 2 years ago. However, the true genius of the settlement lay in the liability distribution. Because Connor had actively hidden his illicit activities from his wife, Aaliyah successfully partitioned the debt. She legally bound him to 100% of his massive gambling deficits, the predatory personal loans he took out to cover his tracks, and the impending federal restitution liabilities he would owe the government. She took the clean capital and effectively bolted the entire anchor of his toxic, fraudulent debt securely around his neck. Connor stared at the settlement document, his eyes scanning the aggressive terms. His public defender had accompanied him, looking thoroughly defeated and quietly advising him to accept the deal. Any judge presented with Aaliyah's forensic audit would likely grant her an even harsher ruling, potentially freezing his remaining legal funds. Connor, however, was not listening to his exhausted attorney. His mind was entirely consumed by the Apex Capital email sitting in his inbox. He did not see a devastating legal loss. He saw a temporary, meaningless setback, driven by his unshakable arrogance and his desperate need to feel superior. Connor actually let out a dismissive, mocking laugh. He looked up at Aaliyah, his expression dripping with sheer condescension, wholly believing he possessed a secret weapon that made her calculated financial demands irrelevant. "You really think you are ruining me?" Connor scoffed, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "You think taking half my clean cash and leaving me with this debt is going to bury me? You are so short-sighted, Aaliyah. You always were. You think you are the smartest person in the room because you can track spreadsheets, but you have no vision. You do not understand how real wealth is generated. Go ahead and take the house equity. Take the car. Take whatever pathetic scraps you think you have won today. I am signing this garbage right now because I do not have the time or the patience to deal with your petty revenge tactics. I have a massive corporate acquisition closing tomorrow morning that is going to make your little accounting victory look like absolute pocket change. I am going to be richer than I have ever been, and you are going to deeply regret jumping off my ship." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and aggressively scrawled his signature across every single page of the settlement agreement. He did not hesitate. He did not ask for modifications. He enthusiastically signed away half his legitimate net worth and accepted sole responsibility for millions of dollars in fraudulent debt, all because his massive ego convinced him that a phantom New York hedge fund was about to hand him the ultimate golden parachute. He shoved the signed documents back across the table, standing up with a triumphant theatrical smirk. He buttoned his jacket, looking down at his brilliant wife, entirely convinced he had just won the divorce. "Enjoy the car, Aaliyah," he sneered, turning his back on her and walking confidently out of the mediation room, eager to prepare for his life-changing meeting in downtown Los Angeles. Aaliyah did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She calmly reached out and pulled the legally binding documents toward her, securing her financial freedom from his impending federal destruction. She looked at Brenda, offering a subtle, satisfied nod. The legal trap was completely locked. Connor had just voluntarily legally shackled himself to a mountain of toxic debt, sacrificing his only clean capital on the altar of his own blind arrogance. He believed he was walking out of that clinic as a soon-to-be wealthy bachelor. 24 hours later, that unshakable delusion propelled Connor down the sun-baked sidewalks of the Los Angeles financial district. He moved with a renewed aggressive swagger, his expensive leather shoes snapping sharply against the concrete. Beside him walked Thomas, looking equally reinvigorated. My father had spent the morning meticulously grooming himself, washing away the undeniable stench of his recent arrest. He wore his finest charcoal gray tailored suit and a silk tie, he usually reserved for high-stakes bank negotiations. Connor mirrored his father's imposing presentation, dressed in a sharp navy blazer that hid the cold sweat of his impending federal indictment. Together they looked exactly like the powerful, untouchable titans of industry they had spent their entire lives pretending to be. They approached the towering glass and steel skyscraper housing Apex Capital, entirely blind to the spectacular execution awaiting them at the very top. The grand lobby was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Soaring marble walls, polished chrome accents, and private security personnel created an atmosphere of absolute exclusivity. Thomas approached the massive reception desk, projecting his chest forward, and confidently announced their arrival for the executive acquisition meeting with Apex Capital. The receptionist simply checked their names against an encrypted digital ledger, nodded politely, and handed them 2 temporary access cards. She directed them toward a private bank of high-speed elevators reserved exclusively for the top floors. Connor took his card with a smug, self-satisfied smirk, entirely convinced his elite status had finally been restored. They stepped into the sleek, mirrored elevator car, and the heavy metal doors slid smoothly shut, sealing them inside. As the elevator silently rocketed upward toward the 50th floor, the immense pressure of their shared financial ruin seemed to evaporate completely. Thomas unbuttoned his suit jacket, letting out a long sigh of profound relief. He looked over at his golden son, a malicious glint sparkling dangerously in his aging eyes. "We survived it, Connor," Thomas declared, his voice echoing with unwarranted triumph. "After today, the heavy debts are completely gone. We are shedding that toxic real estate nightmare and walking away with enough clean liquid capital to fight your legal battles and secure our rightful legacy." The moment the wire transfer clears, our absolute first priority is going on the offensive. Connor adjusted his collar, his lips curling into a vicious, predatory smile. He stared at his own reflection in the polished elevator doors, practically vibrating with renewed arrogance. "I want the best defense attorneys in the state," Connor stated, his voice dripping with entitlement. "But more importantly, we need to completely destroy her. Aaliyah took half my clean assets yesterday and left me carrying the bag for the offshore accounts. She thinks she won. But once I am fully capitalized again, I am going to bury her in civil litigation. And Stella..." He shook his head, a cold laugh escaping his chest. "Stella is going to deeply regret crossing this family." Thomas nodded aggressively, his patriarchal rage bubbling violently back to the surface. "We are going to hire the most ruthless private investigators money can buy," Thomas promised, his tone turning dark and vindictive. "We will dig into every single aspect of Aegis Holdings. We will find every hidden offshore account, every buried corporate secret, and every minor tax discrepancy your ungrateful sister committed. We will systematically leak it to the financial press she used to attack you. We will orchestrate hostile takeovers of her minor subsidiaries. I want her completely ruined, Connor. I want her crawling back to us, begging for financial mercy on her knees just so I can slam the door directly in her face." The elevator chimed a soft melodic note, signaling their arrival at the 50th floor. The polished metal doors slid open, revealing an incredibly expansive reception area that screamed absolute untouchable wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the sprawling Los Angeles skyline, stretching to the glittering ocean. A pristine marble reception desk sat empty, but massive oak double doors stood slightly ajar at the end of a long hallway. A small brass plaque mounted on the wall simply read, "Apex Capital Executive Boardroom." Thomas and Connor stepped out of the elevator, their confidence soaring to dizzying, dangerous new heights. They walked down the silent corridor, the thick carpet muffling their footsteps. They honestly believed they were walking into a sanctuary of financial salvation. They pushed the heavy oak doors fully open and strode confidently into the expansive boardroom. The space was magnificent. A massive polished mahogany conference table dominated the center, surrounded by 20 ergonomic leather executive chairs. High-tech presentation monitors were seamlessly integrated into the sleek, dark-paneled walls. At the far end, glass walls provided a vertigo-inducing view of the bustling city streets 50 stories below. They took their seats near the center of the mahogany table, placing their leather briefcases on the polished surface with synchronized, arrogant thuds. Connor leaned back in his comfortable chair, lacing his fingers together behind his head, thoroughly enjoying the feeling of being a major corporate player once again. He looked over at his father, sharing a silent, deeply satisfied look of mutual victory. They survived the police raid. They survived the brutal television humiliation. They survived the ruthless divorce mediation. They were finally getting their money, and they were going to use every single cent to exact a highly coordinated revenge against the women who dared to challenge their supremacy. They sat in the quiet, climate-controlled boardroom, waiting eagerly for the anonymous hedge fund billionaires to arrive and hand them the keys to their glorious resurrection. They did not notice the subtle click of the heavy oak doors closing automatically behind them. They did not realize that the room they confidently entered was not a place of corporate salvation, but a truly inescapable, meticulously designed execution chamber today. The quiet hum of the climate-controlled ventilation system was the only sound in the expansive room. Thomas and Connor sat in their plush leather chairs, their eyes glued to the heavy oak doors at the far end of the long mahogany table. They expected a team of aggressive, faceless New York hedge fund managers to walk through that threshold. They expected men in expensive suits holding thick contracts that would magically erase their massive debts and save them from complete federal destruction. Instead, the polished brass handle of the right door clicked sharply, breaking the silence and echoing like a gunshot across the room. The heavy oak door swung open with a smooth, deliberate motion. I stepped over the threshold, moving with the cold, calculated precision of a predator, entering a trap it had spent years building. I wore a sharp-tailored obsidian blazer over a crisp silk blouse, my posture radiating absolute unyielding authority. I did not rush. My heels clicked against the hardwood perimeter of the room in a slow, rhythmic cadence that commanded total attention. Connor saw me first. The arrogant, triumphant smirk he had worn since stepping out of the elevator instantly vanished. His jaw dropped and a visible shudder ripped through his shoulders. He blinked rapidly, his mind violently rejecting the visual information his eyes were processing. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost, which in many ways he had. Thomas, sitting directly across from his golden child, followed his son's paralyzed gaze toward the doorway. The moment my father registered my presence, all the arrogant color drained from his face. His hands, previously resting with relaxed confidence on the mahogany surface, suddenly clamped down onto the armrests of his chair with bone-white knuckles. Before either of them could formulate a single word, the second half of their worst nightmare stepped into the boardroom. Aaliyah walked in right behind me. She moved with effortless, devastating elegance, her expression entirely devoid of the fear Connor had expected to see after their brutal divorce mediation yesterday. She was not the defeated ex-wife he thought he had outsmarted. She was a corporate executioner reporting for duty. She walked slightly to my right, her chin held high, projecting an aura of absolute legal supremacy. I walked the entire length of the massive conference table, letting the heavy silence stretch and suffocate the two men sitting midway down the room. I did not offer a greeting. I did not acknowledge their presence. I reached the head of the table, the seat of ultimate power in the room, and slowly lowered myself into the high-backed leather chair. I folded my hands, resting them perfectly still on the polished mahogany surface. Aaliyah mirrored my calm efficiency. She took the seat directly to my right, the traditional position of the chief advisor. With a swift, crisp motion, she placed her heavy leather briefcase onto the table, unlatched the metal clasps, and opened it. Thomas found his voice first, though it was nothing more than a ragged, hoarse whisper. "Stella," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the heavy oak doors, as if still expecting the real hedge fund executives to arrive and save him from this hallucination. "What are you doing here? How did you get past security? You need to leave right now. We are expecting the senior partners from Apex Capital any second. You are going to ruin the most important financial deal of our entire lives." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the cool wood. I let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "I am not ruining your deal, Thomas," I stated, my voice echoing with lethal clarity in the silent room. "I am the deal. I did not sneak past security. I own the security. I own this building, and I own Apex Capital." Connor physically recoiled, pressing his back hard against his chair. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. "That is a complete lie," he shouted, his voice cracking with rising hysteria. "Apex Capital is a massive New York hedge fund. They acquire distressed commercial assets. You are just a runaway who hides behind private security. You do not have the capital to negotiate a buyout of our commercial real estate project. This is another one of your pathetic tricks. You somehow tracked us here and paid someone off to let you into this room just to harass us." Alia reached into her open briefcase and pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing the official seal of the state corporate registry. She slid it smoothly across the mahogany table until it rested exactly between Connor and Thomas. "You should read the corporate structuring documents before you accuse the chairwoman of lying." Connor, Aaliyah instructed, her tone dripping with professional condescension. "Apex Capital is not a standalone hedge fund. It is a highly specialized, fully funded subsidiary division. It was incorporated in Delaware 3 years ago specifically to function as the aggressive acquisition arm for a much larger parent company." Connor stared at the document, his eyes scanning the bold black text. Thomas leaned over his shoulder, his breathing becoming shallow and erratic as he read the undeniable legal proof printed on the page. The parent company listed at the very top of the corporate hierarchy was Aegis Holdings. The realization hit them like a physical shockwave. The invisible, aggressive New York hedge fund they thought was coming to their rescue, the corporate savior they had enthusiastically emailed their financial surrender to, was actually me. I had engineered the entire acquisition. I had baited the hook with the exact amount of cash Connor needed for his criminal defense retainer, knowing his desperation and bottomless greed would force him to bite blindly today. You are looking at the sole proprietor and chief executive officer of Aegis Holdings, I declared, watching their entire world shatter completely into a million pieces. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. I sat at the head of the polished mahogany table, watching the sheer magnitude of my revelation crush the last remaining fragments of their arrogant delusions. Thomas gripped the leather armrests of his chair so tightly, his knuckles turned a sharp, translucent white. He opened his mouth, attempting to formulate a cohesive sentence, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The powerful, commanding patriarch who had spent his entire life dictating the terms of my existence was now reduced to a speechless, terrified old man. Connor was faring much worse. His eyes darted frantically between the corporate documents resting on the table and my perfectly composed face. The realization that he had willingly walked into a meticulously designed financial slaughterhouse caused a violent tremor to rack his shoulders. He aggressively shoved his chair backward, the wheels screeching loudly against the floor, and jumped to his feet. His hands were curled into tight fists at his sides, his face flushed with a dangerous, explosive rage. "You are lying!" Connor screamed, his voice echoing violently off the glass walls of the 50th floor boardroom. "This is a pathetic, elaborate bluff. You do not have the liquid capital to acquire our commercial real estate debts. You are a college dropout. You are a failure who disappeared because you could not handle the pressure of real-world expectations. You spent the last 5 years hiding from us. There is absolutely no way you built a hedge fund." I did not flinch at his sudden outburst. I calmly picked up a sleek black remote control resting near my briefcase and pressed a single silver button. The massive high-definition presentation monitors mounted on the dark paneled walls instantly flared to life. The screens illuminated the dark room with crisp, undeniably clear financial charts, ownership deeds, and legally binding acquisition contracts. I turned my attention to the glowing displays, deliberately ignoring his childish tantrum. "While you two spent the last 5 years pretending I simply vanished because I was too weak to survive without your financial guidance, I was actually quite busy." I explained, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. "I did not drop out of college because I lacked intelligence. I left because staying in your toxic, controlling environment was suffocating my potential. I took the small amount of cash I saved from working 3 night shift jobs and started acquiring low-level consumer debt portfolios. I learned the mechanics of the distressed asset market. I built algorithms to predict default probabilities. I slowly transformed a meager savings account into a highly aggressive, deeply specialized debt acquisition firm." Alia leaned forward, tapping her manicured finger against a specific document on the table. "She built Aegis Holdings into a financial juggernaut while you were busy destroying your career at the bank." Alia added, her tones slicing through his remaining bravado. "She did not just buy random debts. She specialized in hostile corporate debt takeovers. She targets arrogant, incompetent businessmen who over-leverage their assets, and she systematically buys their loans for pennies on the dollar." Thomas finally found his voice, though it emerged as a ragged, terrified gasp. He stared at the massive monitors displaying his own personal signatures on multiple default notices. "You bought our commercial property debt?" Thomas asked, his entire body trembling as the catastrophic truth finally sank in. "You are the sole creditor holding the paper on the abandoned shopping center project." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that offered absolutely no comfort or mercy. "I did not just buy the commercial property debt, Thomas. I bought everything." I raised my hand and gestured toward the glowing screens surrounding us. "Every single time you missed a mortgage payment on that ridiculous suburban mansion you love so much, I swooped in and purchased the note from the distressed asset division of your primary lender. Every time Connor took out a high-interest personal loan to cover his secret offshore gambling addictions, I bought the paper. Every time your contracting business failed to pay its material suppliers, and the accounts went into severe collection status, my firm acquired the liability." Connor fell back into his leather chair, the fight completely draining out of his posture. He covered his face with his trembling hands, letting out a hollow, suffocated groan. The illusion of his impending wealth was entirely shattered. The golden parachute he thought Apex Capital was offering had just wrapped securely around his neck, transforming into an inescapable financial noose. I own it all, I declared, ensuring every single word struck them with maximum impact. I own the mortgage on your house. I own the outstanding lines of credit you fraudulently secured. I own the toxic commercial real estate loans that are currently pushing you into federal bankruptcy. For 5 years, you told all your wealthy country club friends that I was a massive disappointment. You claimed I was an ungrateful daughter who failed to measure up to your precious, brilliant son. You laughed at my ambitions and demanded I sacrifice my own future to fund his continuous mistakes. But while you were busy celebrating your fabricated superiority, I was methodically buying the very ground you walked on. I watched the terrifying truth finally settle completely into their arrogant minds. They had walked into this luxurious corporate sanctuary, expecting a massive, unearned salvation. They found their executioner instead. You thought I was the weak link in this family. You thought you could simply erase me from your prestigious legacy. You were horribly wrong. I am not the ghost daughter you discarded. I am the apex predator of your financial ecosystem. I own every single cent you owe. I control your entire future. And right now, you are sitting in my boardroom, utterly broke, facing federal prison, and begging me to save you from the absolute destruction you brought upon yourselves. The power dynamic has permanently shifted, and you have absolutely nowhere left to run today. I did not wait for their pathetic excuses today. Talking ended the moment they stepped into my headquarters. I reached into my leather briefcase and retrieved a thick, impeccably bound stack of legal contracts. I slid them very smoothly across the polished mahogany table. The paper stopped between Thomas and Connor, resting like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. "Let us review the cold mathematics of your existence," I stated with clinical detachment. Between the toxic commercial project, the defaulted residential mortgages, and the personal loans Connor utilized to mask gambling habits, you owe Aegis Holdings exactly $4.2 million. Every debt is in severe unrecoverable default. You do not possess a single liquid asset to your name. Your bank accounts are entirely frozen. Your credit is completely radioactive. You are financially dead, and I am simply the coroner presenting the final autopsy report. Thomas stared at the contracts, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his panicked lungs. He opened his mouth, but Aaliyah expertly cut him off before he could utter a single syllable of resistance. "Do not attempt to negotiate," Thomas. Aaliyah instructed, her tone radiating absolute legal supremacy. "You are in no position to bargain. If you and your son stand up and walk out of those heavy oak doors today, Stella will immediately trigger the acceleration and default clauses embedded in every single one of your loans. The resulting financial avalanche will be instantaneous and completely catastrophic." I turned my sharp gaze toward my brother. Connor was slumped in his leather chair, trembling violently, looking entirely broken. "For you, Connor, the consequences are exceptionally severe," I explained calmly. "Because you used fraudulent collateral to secure those personal loans, triggering the default clauses will immediately escalate your civil debt into federal wire fraud charges. I will personally hand the default dossier directly to the federal prosecutors who are already building your embezzlement case. Adding another layer of documented wire fraud to your pending indictment will absolutely guarantee you spend the next decade inside a federal penitentiary. You will not see the outside world until your youth is entirely gone." Connor let out a strangled, suffocating gasp, gripping his hair with shaking hands. He knew my threat was not a bluff. He knew Aaliyah possessed the exact forensic proof required to execute him legally. I shifted my attention back to my father. Thomas looked completely hollowed out, a mere shadow of the arrogant patriarch who had terrorized my youth. "And for you, Thomas," I continued, my words striking him with deliberate, calculated cruelty. "You personally guaranteed the commercial real estate loans. When I trigger the defaults, I will unleash a horde of corporate litigators to completely dismantle your life. I will seize the suburban mansion. I will garnish your meager Social Security. I will drag you through a humiliating, highly publicized bankruptcy court until every single person in your elite country club circle witnesses your absolute ruin. You will spend the final years of your life as a destitute, disgraced old man, living in a cheap rented room entirely dependent on government handouts. You will die completely bankrupt, and your precious legacy will be nothing more than a cautionary tale of arrogance and catastrophic failure. The sheer brutality of my detailed execution plan paralyzed them. They were staring directly into the abyss of their own making, and the terror reflecting in their eyes was deeply, profoundly satisfying. I had waited 5 long years for this precise moment. However, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I am willing to offer you exactly one exit strategy. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the thick stack of contracts resting in front of them. You have a single path to avoid federal prison and complete public destruction. You will pick up the pen and you will sign those documents. Thomas stared at the contracts, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "What do they say?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice devoid of all previous authority. "The terms are non-negotiable and absolutely total," Aaliyah declared, reading from her own legal tablet. "By signing those contracts, you are transferring 100% of your remaining corporate shares, all physical assets, and every single future business right directly to Aegis Holdings. You are signing away your ownership of the failed shopping center. You are surrendering the deed to your suburban mansion. You are legally relinquishing any and all claims to your former commercial enterprise. You are handing Stella the absolute undisputed keys to everything you have ever owned or built. You are taking everything." Connor choked out, tears of sheer panic finally spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his pale face. "You are leaving us with absolutely nothing." I smiled, a sharp, cold expression of pure victory. "I am leaving you with your freedom, Connor," I corrected smoothly. "I am allowing you to walk away from a 10-year federal prison sentence. I am allowing Thomas to avoid the suffocating humiliation of public bankruptcy. I am buying your toxic debt, and in exchange, I am acquiring your entire world. You will walk out of this 50-story skyscraper with nothing but the clothes on your backs, but you will walk out as free men. That is the only mercy you will ever receive from me." I pulled a gold-plated pen from my pocket and tossed it onto the mahogany table. It clattered loudly, stopping on the contracts. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest, radiating absolute control. "You have exactly 60 seconds to make your decision," I commanded, staring them down with unyielding authority. "Sign over your entire existence to me right now, or walk out those doors and let the federal agents finish the job. The clock is ticking." The gold pen rested on the mahogany surface, gleaming under the bright lighting of the boardroom. The silence in the room transformed into a suffocating physical weight. Nobody moved. Connor took short, panicked breaths. He stared at the pen as if it were a snake. Thomas looked at me, searching my face for any trace of the obedient daughter he used to control. He found absolutely nothing but cold, impenetrable resolve. As the invisible timer crossed the 20-second mark, the last remnants of my father's patriarchal pride finally snapped. The imposing, arrogant man who had terrorized my entire existence, crumbled completely right in front of my eyes. His shoulders slumped forward and a wet, guttural sob ripped from his throat. Thomas reached across the table, his trembling hands grasping the edge of the mahogany wood as he leaned toward me. "Stella, please," he begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that echoed off the glass walls. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot strip away every single thing we have worked for our entire lives and throw us out onto the street with nothing. We are blood. I am your father. I gave you life. I raised you in a beautiful home. Just give us a fraction of the original payout we agreed upon with Apex Capital. Just 10%. Just enough for Connor to hire a decent lawyer and for your mother and me to rent a small apartment so we do not freeze in the winter. You are my flesh and blood. You have to show us some mercy." His tears fell freely now, splashing onto the pristine legal documents. Connor joined in, weeping openly into his hands, nodding along with his father's pathetic bargaining. They honestly believed that seeing them broken and crying would trigger some deep, ingrained biological loyalty within me. They thought my cold exterior was just a temporary business tactic that would melt away at the sight of my father's genuine tears. I uncrossed my arms and leaned slowly over the massive table, bringing my face closer to his. My expression remained entirely neutral, a stark contrast to his hysterical weeping. Aaliyah sat perfectly still beside me, her eyes locked on Connor with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. "Do you want to talk about blood?" Thomas, I asked softly, my voice completely steady and utterly devoid of pity. "Do you want to talk about the duties of a family? Let us go back exactly 10 years. I was 22 years old. I had just graduated exhausted from working night shifts, holding my first real paycheck. Do you remember what you did that week? Your private contracting business was failing because you embezzled your own company funds to buy a luxury boat. The bank was preparing to foreclose on your corporate assets. You brought me into your home office, locked the door, and placed a massive stack of predatory loan documents in front of me. The principal was $150,000. Thomas flinched, his eyes widening, as the memory of his own horrific cruelty was dragged out into the harsh light. I cried that day. I continued my words, striking him with surgical precision. "I begged you not to make me sign those papers. I told you a high-interest corporate loan in my name would ruin my chances of starting an independent life. I told you I was terrified. And do you remember exactly what you said to me while you forced the pen into my hand?" Thomas shook his head frantically, desperate to avoid the devastating mirror I was forcing him to look into. "You leaned over me." I recalled, my voice growing colder with every single syllable. "You looked at my tears with absolute disgust, and you said, 'You are just a girl. It is your duty to sacrifice for the men in this family.' You forced me to take on a crushing financial burden that nearly broke me, simply because you viewed my existence as a disposable resource to be consumed by your massive egos." Connor stopped his sobbing, looking up at his father with a sick expression, realizing the true depth of the historical rot that had ultimately brought them to this boardroom execution. "You demanded mercy today," I stated, looking down at the two broken men. "But you exhausted all your familial privileges 10 years ago. The family died that day in your home office. You killed it when you decided my life was worth sacrificing for your luxury boat. I am not your daughter anymore. Today is just a collection agency doing its job. I am simply foreclosing on the bad debt you created." I pointed a single perfectly manicured finger at the gold pen resting on the table. "You have exactly 15 seconds left before I call the federal prosecutors. Sign the contracts right now." The absolute finality of my words crushed the last breath of resistance out of their lungs. Thomas let out a long, agonizing wail of pure defeat. He reached out with a trembling, violently shaking hand and picked up the heavy gold pen. His tears dripped onto the crisp white pages as he slowly, painfully dragged the ink across the signature lines, legally signing away his suburban mansion, his remaining corporate shares, and his entire patriarchal legacy. When he finished the massive stack, he pushed the documents toward Connor. Connor did not even bother to read the pages. His eyes were vacant, completely hollowed out by the sheer magnitude of his absolute destruction. He took the pen from his father and signed his own name, officially surrendering everything he owned to the sister he had spent his entire life tormenting. Aaliyah watched them, her face reflecting profound satisfaction. The ink dried quickly, securing my inescapable victory. They dropped the pen back onto the mahogany wood, the loud clatter signaling the official permanent end of their parasitic empire today. Alia reached across the table and collected the signed contracts. She did not review the signatures because their terror guaranteed compliance. She aligned the pages and slipped them into her briefcase. The metal latches snapped shut like a heavy lock on their financial prison cell. I pressed a button on my remote. The oak doors swung open and 4 private security guards stepped inside. They moved with silent efficiency. Their physical presence communicated absolute zero tolerance for any delays. They formed a tight perimeter around Thomas and Connor, waiting for my final command. I looked at the 2 broken men sitting at my table for the very last time. "Leave my building." I ordered, my voice cold and completely devoid of any lingering familial attachment. Connor stood up slowly. His legs shook so violently he had to lean heavily against the leather chair to keep himself upright. He kept his eyes on the floor, his shoulders slumped in ultimate defeat. Thomas followed him, rising with the slow, agonizing stiffness of a man who had just aged 2 decades in a single afternoon. He tried to open his mouth to speak one final time, perhaps, to offer a pathetic apology or a useless plea for future mercy. One of the security guards stepped firmly into his line of sight, blocking him completely and gesturing sharply toward the open doorway. The guards marched them out of the boardroom, guiding them down the long, silent corridor toward the private elevator bank. I watched them disappear through the heavy oak doors, their expensive tailored suits now looking like ridiculous costumes draped over entirely hollowed-out shells. They were completely destroyed, stripped of their power and their pride. The financial empire they had built over a lifetime was now entirely mine to dismantle. The security team escorted them down 50 floors in absolute suffocating silence. When the elevator doors opened into the grand marble lobby, the guards did not allow them to pause or gather their shattered thoughts. They marched Thomas and Connor straight through the revolving glass doors and physically pushed them out onto the unforgiving concrete of the Los Angeles pavement. The blazing California sun hit them with harsh, blinding intensity. They stood on the busy sidewalk as pedestrians brushed past them, completely oblivious to the massive corporate execution that had just taken place high above their heads. Thomas and Connor possessed absolutely nothing. They had no homes to return to. They had no business empire to manage. They had no secret bank accounts to drain. Their golden child status and their patriarchal authority were permanently erased from existence. They were literal ghosts, haunting the edges of a financial world they used to aggressively dominate. Connor pulled out his phone, perhaps out of sheer habit, only to realize his corporate cellular plan would be terminated by sunset. He dropped his arms to his sides, looking up at the towering glass skyscraper with an expression of pure, unadulterated despair. Up on the 50th floor, the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom transformed completely the moment the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind them. The oppressive, suffocating tension vanished, replaced by the crisp, clean air of absolute victory. I let out a long, steady breath, feeling the last remaining phantom chains of my traumatic childhood shatter and fall away from my shoulders forever. Aaliyah smiled brightly, her dark eyes flashing with profound satisfaction and shared triumph. She walked over to a sleek hidden cabinet built into the dark paneled wall. She opened the smooth wooden doors to reveal a custom refrigerated wine cooler. She pulled out a chilled bottle of incredibly rare vintage champagne and 2 crystal flutes. The loud, cheerful pop of the cork echoing through the massive room was the perfect counterpoint to the miserable silence we had just forced upon my family. Alia poured the golden bubbling liquid into the tall crystal flutes, filling them precisely. She walked back to the head of the mahogany table and handed one of the elegant glasses directly to me. We did not offer a complicated toast. We did not need to articulate the sheer magnitude of what we had just accomplished today. We simply clinked our glasses together, the clear musical chime ringing out as a flawless celebration of our hard-fought independence. I took a slow, appreciative sip of the cold champagne, savoring the rich, complex flavor on my tongue. It tasted exactly like pure, unadulterated freedom. I stood up from my executive chair and walked slowly toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the far end of the room. Aaliyah followed me, standing comfortably at my side as we looked out over the sprawling, magnificent city skyline. The world below us looked like a massive, intricate chessboard, and we had just captured the final remaining pieces. I rested my forehead slightly against the cool glass, looking straight down at the busy street 50 stories below our feet. Amidst the chaotic sea of yellow taxicabs and rushing pedestrians, I spotted 2 tiny, pathetic figures standing frozen on the concrete sidewalk. They looked incredibly small, entirely insignificant against the grand, towering scale of the financial district they had completely failed to conquer. Alia took another sip of her champagne, her gaze following mine down to the street level. She let out a soft, highly amused chuckle as she watched Connor helplessly kick a metal trash can before slumping against the side of the building. So Aaliyah asked, her voice carrying a light, playful tone that beautifully masked her brilliant, ruthless mind. "What do we buy next?" I took one final sip of my vintage champagne, keeping my eyes locked on the tiny, defeated figures of my father and brother standing in the harsh afternoon sun. A sharp, deeply satisfied smile spread slowly across my face. They told everyone I disappeared. I said, my voice steady and echoing with absolute permanent authority. They were wrong. I was just busy buying the world they lived in. The story of Stella's relentless rise from a financially abused scapegoat to a formidable corporate powerhouse offers a profound lesson on the true nature of boundaries, self-worth, and toxic loyalty. For years, Stella was conditioned to believe that her value was tied entirely to her usefulness to her family, specifically her ability to absorb the disastrous consequences of her brother's mistakes and her parents' enabling behavior. The most critical lesson we can extract from her journey is that true empowerment often requires a radical, unapologetic detachment from those who exploit you, even if they are blood relatives. Society constantly feeds us the narrative that family is everything, suggesting we owe our parents and siblings infinite chances and bottomless forgiveness, regardless of how cruelly they treat us. Stella's story radically dismantles this harmful myth. When her father forced her into crippling debt and dismissed her worth simply because she was a girl, he shattered the familial contract. Stella realized that waiting for her abusers to miraculously develop empathy or respect was a losing game. Instead of begging for a seat at a table where she was fundamentally disrespected, she walked away in silence and built her own empire from the ground up. By cutting off their financial supply and refusing to participate in their manipulative drama, Stella reclaimed her absolute autonomy. Her ultimate victory was not merely about acquiring their debt, but proving that establishing ironclad boundaries is an act of profound self-preservation, not cruelty. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that broke you, and sometimes the only way to survive is to rewrite the rules entirely. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, what was your turning point, and how did you find the strength to leave? Please share your own experiences and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.